I stood frozen at the edge of the massive hole in my backyard, staring at the crystal-clear water shimmering under the sun. The pool was perfect, too perfect. White lounge chairs lined the edges, a diving board jutted out over the deep end, and even a waterfall feature cascaded over artificial rocks. It looked like something straight out of a luxury resort. But this wasn't a resort. This was my land. I hadn't built a pool. Yet here it was. And standing right beside it, sipping lemonade as if nothing was wrong, was the president of the Homeowners Association, Mark Talbot, looking pleased with himself. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, grinning. My fists clenched. "This is my land. What have you done?" Mark chuckled. "Oh, don't worry about that. The HOA had the funds, and this neighborhood needed a pool. So we built one." I blinked. My mind couldn't process the sheer audacity of what I was hearing. "You built a pool on my property without asking me." Mark sighed as if I were being dramatic. "Oh, come on, don't be difficult. This benefits everyone. Plus, the HOA has some authority over neighborhood development, you know." "Authority?" I took a step closer, heat rising in my chest. "You mean you legally took my land and turned it into a public pool?" Before Mark could respond, a deep, rumbling sound filled the air. A horrible, deafening crack split through the ground. And then, in an instant, the earth beneath us gave way. It all started 3 weeks ago when I first noticed something strange. I had just finished mowing my lawn when I saw a group of workers standing behind my house, examining the ground. They were dressed in orange vests, helmets, and thick boots. At first, I thought maybe they were city workers fixing some underground pipes. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. There were no city trucks nearby, no official logos on their clothes. Just a group of men with measuring tapes and blueprints. I walked up to them. "Hey, what's going on here?" One of the men, a guy with a bushy mustache and a clipboard, looked up. Just doing some preliminary work. Nothing to worry about." "Preliminary work for what?" The man hesitated. That was the first red flag. He glanced at another worker before muttering, "You might want to check with the HOA about that." The HOA. I should have known. I had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and if there was one thing I had learned, it was that the Homeowners Association loved control. They had rules about everything. How short your grass had to be, what color you could paint your door, even how long you could leave your trash cans out. But this was a whole new level. I stormed straight to the HOA office, a small brick building near the entrance of the neighborhood. Inside, behind a wide mahogany desk, sat Mark Talbot, the king of the HOA, a man who enjoyed power a little too much. "Mark, I just found some workers in my backyard. What are they doing?" He barely looked up from his paperwork. "Oh, that? Just a little improvement project. Nothing to stress over." I leaned forward, planting my hands on his desk. "You mean construction on my property?" Mark finally put down his pen and sighed like I was the most annoying person in the world. "Look, it's a community pool, all right? The neighborhood needs one, and your land is the perfect spot." I blinked. "You can't just take my land." "Relax," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "We'll compensate you." "With what?" "A thank you card." Mark smirked. "Actually, we were thinking of a one-time HOA fee reduction. Pretty generous, don't you think?" I nearly lost it. "A fee reduction? You're out of your mind." He leaned back in his chair. "Look, the pool's happening, whether you like it or not. Legally, we could develop land for community use if it benefits the neighborhood." "That's not true." I snapped. Mark shrugged. "You'd be surprised what a well-written clause in the HOA charter allows us to do." I felt my blood boil. "If you break ground on my property, I will sue you." Mark just smiled. "Good luck with that." I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. For the next week, I kept a close eye on my yard, but nothing happened. No construction, no workers, no sign of digging. I thought maybe Mark had backed off. I was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I rushed to my window and froze. Floodlights glowed in my backyard, illuminating an active construction site. Bulldozers, cement trucks, workers with shovels. It was a full-blown operation. They were building the pool. On my land. I grabbed my phone and called the police. "They're trespassing. They're illegally building a pool on my property." When the cops arrived, Mark was there, as smug as ever. He had permits in his hand, permits that somehow had my name on them. Permits I had never signed. Everything is legal, Mark said, grinning. The officer sighed, flipping through the papers. Sir, this seems to be an HOA issue. You may need to take it to court. Court? That would take months. By then, the pool would already be finished. I had never felt so powerless. For the next few weeks, I watched helplessly as the construction continued. They laid down concrete, installed the pool tiles, even built a freaking diving board. The whole time, Mark would stop by, sipping lemonade like he was the king of the world. And then came today. The pool was complete. The HOA had sent out flyers, inviting the entire neighborhood to the grand opening. I woke up to the sound of splashing, laughing, and music. My backyard had been turned into a public pool overnight. I stormed outside, rage burning through me. Everyone out. This is my land. Mark sauntered over, acting like he owned the place. Relax. It's done. Nothing you can do now. And that's when the ground began to shake. A loud, deep crack split through the earth. The water in the pool trembled. The artificial waterfall flickered. People screamed as the ground beneath the pool started to give way. A massive sinkhole was forming, right beneath their illegally built pool. And then with one final, deafening boom, the pool collapsed. Water exploded in every direction. Concrete shattered. Lounge chairs tumbled into the abyss. The entire HOA project was swallowed whole. Mark Talbot stood there, drenched, stunned into silence. I turned to him, the ghost of a smile on my lips. Well, Mark, looks like Mother Nature just served some justice. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, chaos erupted. People screamed and scrambled away from a massive hole where the pool had once been. Water surged over the edges, rushing like a flood through my backyard, soaking the grass and sweeping away pool chairs and towels. The artificial waterfall was now just a broken heap of rocks, half sunken into the sinkhole. Mark Talbot stood there, drenched from head to toe, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. His once pristine polo shirt was stuck to his body, and his expensive loafers were now covered in mud. I crossed my arms, watching him struggle to comprehend what had just happened. He sputtered. This is your fault. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, I don't recall illegally building a pool on someone else's land. His face turned red. You did something. This was perfectly safe. A loud creak interrupted him as the ground shifted again. The sinkhole groaned, swallowing more of the broken pool, making it clear that this wasn't over yet. The remaining people bolted for safety, not wanting to be anywhere. My neighbors, many of whom had been enjoying my backyard like it was their personal resort, were now standing on the sidewalk, watching in shock. Then, the sirens started. Fire trucks, police cars, and even a few news vans came racing down the street. The HOA had thrown a big grand opening party for the pool, and now it was turning into a full-blown disaster scene. 2 firefighters rushed toward me, their boots splashing through the flooded lawn. Sir, are you the homeowner? I nodded. Can you tell us what happened? I didn't even get a chance to answer before Mark butted in, waving his hands wildly. We built this pool for the community, and his property collapsed. He should have maintained the land properly. I turned to him, barely containing my laughter. I should have maintained the land? You stole my backyard and built an entire pool on it without my permission. Maybe you should have done a soil test before pouring tons of concrete into the ground. One of the firefighters frowned. Wait, you're saying the HOA built this pool without your approval? Oh, he approved it. Mark snapped, then turned to me. You signed the permits. I smirked. I'd love to see those permits, Mark. The real ones. Because I never signed anything. A flicker of panic crossed his face. The police officer, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward. Mr. Talbot, do you have documentation proving the property owner consented to this construction? Mark hesitated. I have the paperwork in my office. Then I suggest you retrieve it. Because if you forged signatures or authorized construction on private property without consent, we're going to have a serious problem. I had never seen Mark turn so pale. Meanwhile, the firefighters examined the sinkhole, shaking their heads. This is bad, one of them muttered. It looks like the weight of the pool caused the ground to collapse. Could be an underground water pocket or weak soil. Will it get bigger? I asked. Possibly, the firefighter admitted. We'll need an expert to check it out, but for now, no one should go near it. Mark groaned. Rubbing his face like this was just a minor inconvenience. Okay, so we have a little setback. We can fix it. You'll just what? I interrupted. Fill the hole and pretend this never happened? Do you even realize how much damage you've done? Not just to my property, but to the entire neighborhood? What if someone had gotten hurt? Mark didn't answer. He was too busy glaring at the police officer who had just pulled out a notepad and was scribbling something down. Mr. Talbot, the officer said, until we can verify the legality of this construction, I suggest you stop talking. Mark's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I let out a breath, finally feeling like I had the upper hand. But this wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. As the firefighters continued their assessment, the news crew set up their cameras. A reporter, dressed in a sleek blue suit, adjusted her microphone before stepping forward. Sir, she said, turning to me, we understand that the Homeowners Association built this pool on your property without permission. Can you tell us how you're feeling right now? I looked at the cameras, then at Mark. A slow grin spread across my face. Oh, I'm feeling great, I said, because justice is being served in real time. Mark groaned. Oh, give me a break. The reporter turned to him. Mr. Talbot, do you have a statement regarding the HOA's involvement in this unauthorized construction? Mark forced a smile, though his eye was twitching. We were simply trying to improve the community. A loud splash interrupted him. Everyone turned just in time to see a huge chunk of the broken pool deck crumble into the sinkhole. Mark flinched, his fake smile vanishing. The reporter turned back to me. Looks like this improvement isn't going as planned. I couldn't help but chuckle. No, it is not. The police officer sighed and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. All right, Mr. Talbot. I think we've seen enough. You're coming with us for questioning. Mark's eyes widened. What? You can't arrest me. I didn't do anything. Building on private property without consent, forging documents. Those are serious allegations. The officer took Mark's wrist and snapped the cuffs on. You'll have a chance to explain everything at the station. I watched, arms crossed, as Mark was led toward the police car, still spluttering and protesting. It felt good to see him finally face the consequences of his actions. But as I looked back at the massive sinkhole in my backyard, a new thought crept into my mind. This wasn't over yet, because if Mark had forged permits to build on my land, what else had the HOA been hiding? I watched as Mark was driven away in the police car, his protests fading into the distance. For a moment, I stood there, feeling a strange sense of victory. I had won this round. The pool that had been built without my permission, the illegal construction on my land, had all come crashing down. And now, Mark Talbot was in police custody. But something nagged at me. What if this wasn't just about a rogue HOA president? What if there was more to this than I realized? The sound of sirens in the distance slowly faded, and I turned back to the wreckage in my backyard. The sinkhole, which had swallowed the pool, was still growing, threatening to devour more of my lawn. The entire neighborhood was now buzzing with news of what had happened. People were standing at the edge of my property, some recording the disaster on their phones, others talking amongst themselves. I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned to find my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, standing behind me. She was an elderly woman, always quick with a smile and a plate of cookies, but right now her face was filled with concern. I heard the commotion, she said. Is everything all right? I mean, it looks like the entire backyard is gone. I sighed. Not everything's all right. The HOA built a pool on my land without my permission. And now, the land's collapsing. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. This is awful. I knew they were trying to do something with that plot of land, but I didn't realize they'd go this far. I frowned, looking at her. What do you mean? You knew. She hesitated, glancing nervously at the reporters standing on the sidewalk. Well, I overheard some of the other HOA members talking a while ago. They mentioned plans for the pool on your property, but I didn't know if it was true. I thought maybe it was just talk. That caught my attention. What else did they say? She seemed unsure, glancing around as if worried someone might be listening. She lowered her voice. They said something about making sure the project got done no matter what. They didn't mention your land specifically, but I think they were aware it would be a problem. Maybe even planned for it. My blood ran cold. Could they have known the land was unstable? Did they expect this to happen? I glanced back at the hole where the pool had once been. The ground still felt loose under my feet, as though the earth was threatening to give way again. That doesn't sound good. You're telling me they knew it was going to be risky, but they did it anyway. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. It's just what I heard. I don't know for sure. I took a deep breath, trying to process this new information. If the HOA knew the land was unstable and went ahead with the pool anyway, there could be more at play here than just greed. Maybe they were willing to take dangerous risks for the sake of the project. As I stood there, deep in thought, the police officer returned to my side. Mr. Richardson, he said, his voice calm but serious. We've got a problem. I turned to him. What now? The officer's brow furrowed. We found something when we checked the paperwork that Mr. Talbot provided. Some of the permits, they've been altered. My stomach twisted. Altered? What do you mean? We believe they were forged, the officer continued. It looks like someone at the HOA may have doctored official documents to make it seem like everything was above board. We're still investigating, but this is bigger than just one person making a bad decision. I felt a rush of anger. So this wasn't just Mark going rogue? He had help. The officer nodded. It seems that way. We're trying to get to the bottom of it, but it's clear now that this was part of a bigger plan. I stood there, trying to wrap my head around it all. The idea that this was bigger than just Mark, that there were others involved, maybe even members of the HOA, made me feel like I was caught in the middle of something I didn't fully understand. Suddenly, a voice interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Richardson. I turned to see a man in a suit walking toward me. He had dark hair, a stern look on his face, and a badge hanging from his neck. Who are you? I asked. The man flashed his badge. Detective Adams, local police. I'm heading up the investigation into the sinkhole and the HOA's involvement in the pool construction. Mind if I ask you a few questions? I nodded. Sure, but I'm still trying to piece together what's going on myself. He smiled, but it was tight-lipped. I understand. I'm hoping you can help us with some of that. We're going through the paperwork, but there's something strange in the way this whole project was handled. I'd like to know more about your interactions with Mark Talbot and the HOA. I sighed and began recounting everything. The conversation I had with Mark at the HOA office, the construction workers on my property, and how Mark had insisted everything was legal, even when I knew it wasn't. Detective Adams listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he looked up at me. You've been pretty patient, Mr. Richardson, but I need to ask, do you think Mark Talbot was acting alone, or was there someone else behind this? I thought for a moment. I don't know, but after hearing what Mrs. Jenkins said, I'm starting to think it wasn't just him. There could be more people involved, people in the HOA who were in on this from the start. Adams nodded. That's what we're investigating now. We've pulled some of the HOA's financial records, and there are some irregularities. It looks like they might have funneled funds into this project without proper approval. My heart sank. If they had been misusing HOA funds, this was bigger than just an illegal pool. This was about corruption, and if that was true, I needed to know who else was involved. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from the sinkhole. We all turned to see the ground shifting again, and a large chunk of earth near the edge of the hole collapsed. Water gushed out, flooding into the yard. I backed away instinctively. It's still unstable. The whole backyard could go. Adams held up a hand to signal for everyone to stay back. Stay clear, everyone. We don't want anyone getting hurt. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. The situation was spiraling out of control. What started as a pool on my property had now become a public disaster, and I was caught in the middle of it. But one thing was clear. Mark Talbot wasn't the only one who needed to be held accountable. There were others who had conspired with him, others who had signed off on this reckless plan, and they needed to be stopped before things got even worse. And I was going to make sure of it. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a red-orange glow over the mess that was once my backyard. The sinkhole had grown larger, and with each passing moment, the ground seemed to tremble more. A sense of unease settled over me as I watched the workers and the emergency teams carefully trying to secure the area. But something felt off. As I looked over at the wreckage of the pool, the collapsing edges of the hole, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something much bigger than I had first imagined. Mark Talbot was already in police custody, but if the detective was right, there were more people involved in this mess. And those people were out there, still running the HOA, still pulling the strings. I had to find out who they were. Mr. Richardson, Detective Adams called out from the other side of the yard. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I walked over to him, feeling a strange sense of anticipation building in my chest. "What's going on? Do you have any news?" Adams gave me a quick nod. "We've pulled some of the HOA's financial records. Looks like the pool project was part of a much larger plan. There's a pattern of suspicious transactions dating back several months. Money being funneled into an emergency repair fund, but it doesn't line up with anything in the neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We believe the HOA may have been using that fund to cover up other mismanagement. Funds were being moved around, likely to cover up other illegal activities. The pool may have been an attempt to cover for something much bigger. They needed a way to launder money or divert attention, and the pool seemed like a perfect way to do that." I took a step back, processing his words. "Are you saying this whole pool project was a cover-up for something illegal?" Adams nodded grimly. "That's what we're investigating now. We're pulling more records, trying to piece everything together. But we need more time." I swallowed hard. "Do you have any idea who else might be involved?" He looked over at the police officers who were still milling around, collecting evidence. "We're still putting it all together, but it seems likely that other members of the HOA were involved. The transactions show that more people were complicit in this." I glanced back at the hole in the yard, where the sinkhole was still swallowing chunks of earth. "How can I help?" Detective Adams eyed me carefully. "You've already given us a lot of information, but if you can think of anyone else who might have been involved or any other interactions you had with the HOA, it would be helpful." I thought for a moment. Mark was bad, but I had a feeling that the others involved in the HOA would be just as ruthless. If there were more people conspiring with him, I couldn't just sit back and let them get away with it. Suddenly, an idea popped into my head. "There's someone who might know more," I said. "Mrs. Jenkins mentioned overhearing things. She might know something else." Detective Adams gave a slight nod. "Good idea. I'll talk to her. But for now, I need you to stay out of the way while we continue gathering information." I hesitated. What if they try to do something else? I don't want this to happen again. Adams looked me in the eye. "We'll make sure no one else gets hurt, Mr. Richardson. But stay alert. Things are going to get messy." I didn't feel entirely reassured, but I nodded. As the detective walked off to speak with Mrs. Jenkins, I felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. I needed answers, and if that meant digging into the HOA's shady dealings, I was ready. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed to make sure I had the right people on my side. I spent the next few hours walking around the yard, avoiding the emergency workers as they made their final assessments of the damage. The police had set up a perimeter, ensuring no one could get too close to the growing sinkhole. I found a spot near the edge of the yard where I could keep an eye on everything happening around me. But as I stood there, something caught my eye. A figure moved through the crowd of emergency workers and reporters, someone who didn't seem to belong. They were tall, dressed in a dark jacket and slacks, and they kept their head down, looking around nervously. I couldn't see their face, but something about the way they moved made me suspicious. They weren't acting like the usual crowd of reporters or police officers. They were trying to blend in. I decided to follow them. Carefully, I stayed behind, trying to keep a safe distance. The person weaved through the crowd, eventually disappearing behind the police cars parked at the edge of the yard. I quickened my pace, moving to the side of the house where I thought I'd seen them turn. When I rounded the corner, I froze. The person was standing there, talking to someone. Mark Talbot. I could barely make out what they were saying, but the low voices and quick glances between them told me they were up to something. Mark was out of police custody. How? And who was he talking to? I took a step closer, trying to get a better look, but then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Detective Adams. "Mr. Richardson, stay where you are. We've got a situation. Stay alert." I frowned, reading the message again. Was this the situation? Was this person with Mark part of the plan? I felt a knot in my stomach. Something was going on, and I needed to figure out what it was. But before I could take another step, the figure turned. They saw me. I froze, heart pounding, as the person's eyes locked with mine. For a brief moment, we stared at each other. Then, without a word, they turned and hurried off into the shadows. I stood there, my mind racing. What had I just seen? And why did I feel like I was being pulled deeper into something that was much darker than just a pool and a sinkhole? I barely had time to react before the mysterious figure disappeared into the night. Mark, still standing by the police cars, seemed frozen in place, his face pale as he watched the person vanish into the shadows. For a moment, I debated chasing after them. My heart was pounding, every instinct screaming that this was important. Whoever that was, they were involved. They knew something. Maybe they were even calling the shots. But my phone buzzed again. "Stay where you are. We're on our way." It was Detective Adams. I clenched my fists, torn between chasing the stranger or waiting for backup. But before I could make a decision, Mark Talbot turned and saw me. His face twisted into something ugly. Anger, fear, maybe both. "You," he spat, pointing a finger at me like I was the one who had just been caught. I crossed my arms. "Me? You're the one sneaking around after getting arrested." His eyes darted around, realizing the police were still nearby. He lowered his voice, but took a step toward me. "You don't know what you've done." I scoffed. "Oh, I think I have a pretty good idea. You and your little HOA goons have been covering something up, and it's all coming apart, isn't it?" Mark's jaw clenched, but before he could answer, a car door slammed behind him. Detective Adams and two uniformed officers approached quickly. "Mr. Talbot," Adams said, his voice calm but firm, "you were released pending further investigation, but I'm going to need to ask you a few more questions. Right now." Mark looked like a cornered animal. This is harassment. I already told you. I was just trying to help the community." Adams didn't flinch. "Sure you were. But now we have new evidence, and you're going to come with us to explain it." Mark glanced at me, and for the first time, I saw it, true fear in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance. Fear. "What are you so scared of, Mark?" I asked, tilting my head. "Who was that person you were talking to?" Mark's mouth opened, then shut. His eyes flickered toward the shadows where the person had disappeared. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the police car. Adams motioned for the officers to take him in, then turned to me. "Did you see who he was talking to?" I nodded. Not clearly, but whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They left as soon as they spotted me. Adams rubbed his chin. "Interesting. That means someone else is pulling the strings." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "What's the deal with Mark, anyway? Why is he out already?" Adams frowned. "It's a mess. He's got a lawyer, and we don't have enough to hold him, yet. But now that we have evidence of forged documents and financial misconduct, we're getting closer." I looked back toward the sinkhole in my backyard, still a gaping wound in the earth. "So what now?" Adams exhaled. "Now, we dig deeper. No pun intended." I rolled my eyes. He continued, "We're investigating the HOA's financial records and cross-referencing them with city permits. Someone else approved this project, someone with enough pull to get forged documents through the system. That's what we need to find." A thought hit me like a brick. Wait, what if this goes beyond the HOA? What if someone higher up, maybe in city planning, signed off on this? Adams nodded. "That's exactly what I'm thinking. This isn't just about Mark and the HOA anymore. If city officials were involved, this could go deep." I exhaled sharply. I had started this fight because of a stolen backyard. Now I was knee-deep in a corruption scandal. "Be careful, Mr. Richardson," Adams warned. "If someone powerful is behind this, they won't be happy that you're poking around." "Noted," I muttered. Just then, Mrs. Jenkins approached. Her usual warmth was replaced with a serious expression. I heard what happened, and I remembered something else. Adams and I both turned to her. "What is it?" Adams asked. She lowered her voice. "A few weeks ago, I saw Mark meeting with someone outside the HOA office. A man in a suit, real professional looking. I didn't think much of it then, but now I realize he looked like someone from the city planning department." Adams' eyes lit up. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "Positive. I even heard part of their conversation. The man said something about pushing the paperwork through quickly so there wouldn't be any delays." I felt my stomach drop. That was it. Someone in the city had approved this mess. Adams looked at me. Looks like we have our next lead. I crossed my arms, and I think it's time we started pushing back. The next day, I sat in my car outside the city planning office, waiting. Adams had managed to pull a name from the records. Daniel Everett, a senior official in the city's development department. He had signed off on the forged permits. I didn't know how deep his involvement went, but I intended to find out. I watched as a sleek black car pulled up to the building. A man in his late 50s stepped out, dressed in a crisp suit. He had an air of confidence, the kind that came from years of power. Daniel Everett. As he walked toward the entrance, I stepped out of my car. "Mr. Everett," I called. He turned, surprised. "Yes." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think we need to talk." For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance? Concern? Fear? But then, he straightened his tie and smirked. "I'm a busy man. What's this about?" I took a step closer. "It's about the illegal pool that was built on my land. The one you approved." His smirk faltered for half a second. Then he laughed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone, showing him a screenshot of his signature on the fraudulent permits. "Really? Because this says otherwise." His face darkened. "You have two options," I continued. "Tell me everything, or wait for the police to come knocking." For the first time, Daniel Everett looked rattled, and I knew I had him. Daniel Everett's smirk vanished. His face turned pale as he stared at the evidence on my phone, the fraudulent permits with his signature on them. His eyes darted around, scanning the parking lot as if looking for an escape route. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low but firm. "You approve those permits, Daniel. Either you're in on it, or you've been used. Which one is it?" He let out a nervous chuckle, but I could see the sweat forming on his forehead. "Look, I don't know where you got this, but I sign off on dozens of projects every week. I can't be expected to remember every single one." I raised an eyebrow. "So you just accidentally approved a multi-million-dollar community pool project built on land the HOA didn't own? That's one heck of a mistake." He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "We already know about the fake documents, the financial irregularities, and now you, the city official who pushed it all through. So either you start talking, or you're going down with Mark Talbot and the rest of them." His jaw clenched. I could see the internal battle he was having. Then, finally, he sighed and rubbed a hand down his face. "Fine," he muttered, "but not here. Get in the car." I hesitated for half a second before following him. He climbed into the driver's seat of his black sedan, and I slid into the passenger seat. The moment I closed the door, he exhaled sharply. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. I crossed my arms. "Then explain what was supposed to happen." He drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "The HOA came to me months ago with a pool project. They said it was a major benefit to the community and they needed expedited approval. But there were issues, land ownership disputes, zoning problems. Things that would have delayed the project for months if handled properly. So, instead of doing your job, you just pushed it through?" He shot me a glare. I was pressured. Mark Talbot didn't act alone. There were others backing him. People with real influence. My stomach twisted. "Who?" He hesitated. "A developer. Name's Richard Vance. Owns several construction firms that work with the city. He's been in the game for years, always getting special contracts, always finding ways around red tape. He wanted that pool built, and he made sure it happened by any means necessary." I frowned. Why would a big-time developer care about some neighborhood pool? Daniel shook his head. "Because it wasn't just about the pool. The HOA had plans for more than that. The pool was just the first phase of a massive development project. If it had gone through, they would have built new housing, expanded commercial lots, turned this neighborhood into a high-end real estate investment." My breath caught in my throat. They were going to destroy the neighborhood. "But the sinkhole ruined everything," I muttered. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "Yeah, Mother Nature did what the law couldn't. But the people behind this? They aren't going to take this loss lightly. You exposed the corruption, but now you're on their radar." I exhaled slowly. "So what happens next?" Daniel hesitated before glancing at me. "If you're smart, you'll back off. Let the police handle it. You got what you wanted. The pool's gone. Mark's in trouble. But Vance? He's not the kind of man you want as an enemy." I clenched my fists. "And if I don't back off, Daniel looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. Then you better watch your back. I nodded, then reached for the door handle. You need to tell the cops everything, Daniel. If you do that, maybe you won't go down with the rest of them. He swallowed hard. Yeah, maybe. I stepped out of the car and watched as he pulled away. My mind was spinning. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. This wasn't just an HOA scam. This was a full-scale land grab. And if Richard Vance had his way, my neighborhood was next on the chopping block. I barely had time to process what I had just learned before my phone rang. Detective Adams. Richardson, where are you? He asked the moment I picked up. I just had a conversation with Daniel Everett, I said. And we have a bigger problem than we thought. There was a pause. You met with him? He admitted to pushing the permits through. Said he was pressured by a developer, Richard Vance. Adams let out a slow breath. Vance? That's not good. You know him? I asked. He's been on our radar before, Adams admitted. Always skirting the line between legal and illegal. He's got money, connections, and people willing to look the other way. If he's involved, that means this whole thing is way bigger than just a rogue HOA. I felt a chill run down my spine. So what do we do? I'll put in a request for surveillance on Vance, but it won't be easy. He's got friends in high places. And if he catches wind that we're onto him, he'll cover his tracks, I finished. Exactly. A thought struck me. If Vance has been doing this for years, there must be other projects he's pulled this kind of scam on, right? Adams was silent for a moment. You might be onto something. If we can find another case, another illegal land grab linked to him, we can build a real case. One he can't slip out of. I nodded. Then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out everything I can about Richard Vance. Adams hesitated. Be careful, Richardson. Vance plays dirty. If he thinks you're a threat, I can handle myself, I said. I hope so, Adams muttered. Because once you start this, there's no turning back. I hung up, my mind already racing. Mark had been a pawn. Daniel had been pressured. But Richard Vance? He was the king. And if I was going to stop him, I had to move fast. I walked back toward my house, my backyard still a disaster zone from the sinkhole. It felt symbolic, like the truth was finally coming to the surface. I had started this fight over a stolen backyard. Now, I was about to take on the most powerful man in town. And I wasn't backing down. I sat in my car outside my house, staring at the wreckage of my backyard. The sinkhole, the ruined pool, the debris. It was all a monument to the corruption I had uncovered. But now, things were bigger than just me. Richard Vance, a name I hadn't known a few hours ago, but now, it was all I could think about. He had been pulling the strings behind the HOA, pushing city officials like Daniel Everett to approve illegal developments. The pool was just a start. If the sinkhole hadn't happened, they would have bulldozed this neighborhood and turned it into a high-end real estate project, all while pretending it was for community improvement. And now that I knew the truth, I was in danger. I pulled out my phone and started searching for Richard Vance. It didn't take long to find him. Wealthy developer, CEO of Vance Urban Developments. A major player in city projects for over 20 years. Tied to multiple controversial deals, though nothing had ever stuck. Every article painted him as an ambitious businessman, but reading between the lines, I could see it. This guy wasn't just successful. He was untouchable. Until now, I dug deeper, clicking through old news articles, lawsuits, community protests against his projects. In almost every case, he had gotten what he wanted. Zoning laws changed. Permits rushed. Land mysteriously becoming available right before one of his companies bought it. And then I found something interesting. An old case from 5 years ago. An apartment complex collapse. Crestview Towers. Vance had been the developer behind it. The official story? Poor maintenance by the property owners. The real story? The land had been unstable. There had been warnings. Geologists had raised concerns. But the project had gone ahead anyway, just like the pool in my backyard. And then, 1 year later, the building collapsed. Lives were lost. Families displaced. Lawsuits were filed. And yet, Vance walked away untouched. I clenched my fists. This wasn't a one-time thing. This man had a history of ignoring safety, cutting corners, and getting away with it. And now, he had come for my neighborhood. Not this time. I grabbed my phone and called Detective Adams. Richardson, He answered immediately. You got something? Oh yeah. I said, my voice hard. Vance did this before. Crestview Towers. 5 years ago. The same pattern, warnings about the land, rushed approval, disaster. People died, Adams. And he walked away clean. I heard Adams curse under his breath. I remember that case. But there was never enough to pin it on him. He had too many people covering for him. Not this time, I said. If we can connect the HOA's scam to him, prove he pressured city officials, prove this wasn't just an accident, then we can take him down. Adams hesitated. That's a big if. We need a direct link. We need someone inside his operation to flip on him. I exhaled slowly. Then we find someone. Be careful, Richardson. Vance is powerful. And if he thinks you're coming for him. I know. I interrupted. But I can't walk away from this. Adams sighed. All right, let's do this right. I'll start working the official angle, financial records, permits, anything that ties him to this fraud. But you, keep your head down. Don't do anything reckless. I ended the call, but I already knew I wasn't going to follow Adams' advice. I needed to get closer to Vance, and I had an idea how. Breaking in. That night, I drove across town to the headquarters of Vance Urban Developments. A sleek, glass-covered building in the heart of the city, surrounded by well-manicured landscaping and a parking lot filled with expensive cars. Vance was at the top of his game, and his office reflected that. I wasn't stupid enough to think I could just walk in and ask for answers. But I had another plan. I'd spend hours online, digging up employee records, searching LinkedIn profiles, looking for someone who might be useful. That's when I found Scott Harlow. Scott was a junior project manager at Vance's company. But more importantly, he had been assigned to oversee the HOA pool project. If anyone knew what was really going on, it was him. I waited outside the office until I saw him leaving. A young guy, maybe early 30s, wearing a button-down and slacks, looking exhausted as he walked his car. Perfect. I pulled my car up beside him just as he was unlocking his door. Scott Harlow. I called out. He turned, startled. Oh yeah? Who's asking? I gave him a tight smile. Just a guy who wants to know why your company is forging permits and building on private land. His face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. I leaned against his car. Really? Because your name is all over the project documents for the HOA pool. And now it's all falling apart. Mark Talbot's in custody. The city's investigating. And your boss? He's going to throw someone under the bus. Want to take a guess who? Scott swallowed hard. He was sweating. I could see it. The fear in his eyes. He knew. You don't understand, he said, voice shaking. I didn't have a choice. Vance, he owns people. You don't say no to him. Then why don't you help me? I asked. Before he decides you're the one to take the fall? Scott looked around nervously. I need time to think. I stepped forward. You don't have time. If Vance knows the cops are on to him, what do you think he's going to do? Hand himself over? No. He's going to cover his tracks. And if that means making sure you disappear. Scott's breath hitched. He knew I was right. Finally, he exhaled. All right. Fine. But not here. Meet me tomorrow. 9 p.m. Parking lot behind the old train station. I nodded. I'll be there. He got in his car and drove off, still looking shaken. I watched him go, knowing this was my best shot. If Scott had information, I could finally blow this whole thing wide open. But as I got back in my car, a chill ran down my spine, because I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced in my rearview mirror. A black SUV was parked across the street. No headlights on, no movement, just sitting there, waiting. I swallowed hard and started my car, pulling away. As I turned onto the main road, I checked my mirror again. The SUV pulled out too. They were following me. My hands tightened on the wheel. Vance knew, and now I was in his sights. The black SUV stayed on me, its headlights off, blending into the traffic like a shadow. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. If they were following me, they wanted me to know I was being followed, which meant they weren't planning on losing me. I turned onto a side street, then quickly veered into a gas station parking lot. I pulled up to a pump, acting casual as I killed the engine. The SUV didn't follow. Instead, it kept driving, rolling past the station like nothing was out of the ordinary. But I wasn't fooled. I waited, pretending to check my phone while keeping an eye on my mirrors. Sure enough, the SUV turned at the next intersection and circled back, parking across the street with its engine running. I exhaled slowly. They weren't here to attack me. Yet. They were watching, letting me know that they could get to me whenever they wanted. I had officially pissed off the wrong people. I grabbed the gas pump, pretending to fuel up, then casually walked inside the station. The cashier barely looked up as I made my way to the back of the store. Then, without hesitation, I slipped out the side exit. I sprinted through the alley behind the station, weaving between dumpsters and old delivery crates. When I reached the next block, I slowed down and ducked into the entrance of a 24-hour laundromat. From there, I had a perfect vantage point to see my car. 2 minutes passed, then 3. Finally, the SUV's doors opened, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They walked straight toward my car. One of them knocked on the driver's side window, while the other scanned the area. When they realized I wasn't inside, they exchanged a few words, then got back in their SUV and drove off. I let out a slow breath. They weren't here to kill me. Not yet. But they wanted me to know I was being watched. I pulled out my phone and dialed Detective Adams. He picked up on the second ring. "Richardson, I just got tailed," I said, keeping my voice low. 2 guys in suits. They followed me, waited outside, then checked my car when I ditched them. Adams cursed under his breath. "Vance's people." "Yeah," I muttered. "And they're not trying to be subtle." Adams sighed. "That's a message. They want you scared. They want you to back off." I gritted my teeth. "Not happening." There was a pause. "I figured you'd say that." I looked at the time. It was nearly 10 p.m. My meeting with Scott Harlow was still a day away, but now I was wondering if he'd even make it that long. "They're probably watching him too," I said. "Most likely," Adams admitted. "We need to move fast. Do not go home tonight. If they're tailing you, they know where you live." That thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Great. So what's the plan?" "I'll send a patrol to do a drive-by near your house. See if anyone's parked outside. But for now, you need to lay low. Find somewhere safe. Somewhere they won't expect." I ran through my options. I couldn't risk staying at a friend's place. They'd check there. Hotels? Too easy to track. Then, an idea hit me. "I know a place," I said. "Good," Adams replied. "Keep your phone on. I'll call you if we get anything on Vance." I hung up and made my way out of the laundromat, keeping to the shadows as I walked several blocks before calling a rideshare. I wasn't going home. I was going somewhere Vance's people wouldn't think to look. I was going to Mrs. Jenkins' house. The safe house. Mrs. Jenkins opened the door, confused at first. But when she saw my face, her expression changed to worry. "Come inside, dear," she said quickly, ushering me in. I stepped in her cozy living room, my nerves still buzzing from the chase. The smell of lavender and old books filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. She sat me down and handed me a cup of tea before taking a seat across from me. "Now," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "Tell me everything." I did. From the HOA's illegal land grab to Mark's arrest, from Daniel Everett's confession to Richard Vance's involvement, and finally, the men following me tonight. By the time I finished, Mrs. Jenkins' face had gone pale. "This is worse than I thought," she murmured. I leaned forward. "You thought something like this was happening?" She sighed. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. I've seen a lot of shady dealings. But this is something else entirely." I nodded. "Vance is dangerous. But I have a meeting with Scott Harlow tomorrow night. He might be the key to bringing all of this down." Mrs. Jenkins frowned. "Are you sure you can trust him?" "No," I admitted. "But he's scared. And scared people talk." She nodded slowly, then reached into a side drawer and pulled something out. A small, dusty notebook. I raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She handed it to me. "Records. Names. Notes I've taken over the years about suspicious things in this neighborhood. If you're going to take on someone like Vance, you need all the help you can get." I flipped through the pages, my eyes widening. Old HOA members. City officials. Business deals. She had been watching them for years. "Mrs. Jenkins," I said slowly, "you might have just given me exactly what I need." She smiled. "Then use it well." The trap. The next night, I drove to the meeting spot, an old, abandoned train station on the outskirts of town. Scott had chosen it because it was quiet, hidden, a good place for a secret meeting. But I had a bad feeling about it. I parked a block away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. The parking lot was empty except for Scott's car. He was leaning against the hood, looking around nervously. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Scott. He jumped, spinning around. Geez, man, don't sneak up on me. Did anyone follow you? I asked. He shook his head. I don't think so. I studied him. He was jittery, sweaty. He looked like a man who had already decided he was in over his head. All right, I said. Tell me everything you know about Vance's plan. Scott swallowed hard. I can't, man. It's too dangerous. I stepped closer. Scott, if you don't talk, Vance will make sure you never do. His eyes darted around. Okay, listen. The pool was just the beginning. The HOA, Vance had them working on. A sharp crack rang through the air. Scott gasped and staggered back. I caught him as he collapsed. Blood. A gunshot. Scott Harlow had just been silenced. I spun around, heart racing, searching for the shooter. But the parking lot was empty. No movement. No sound. Whoever had pulled the trigger was already gone. I clutched Scott as he struggled to breathe. His eyes locked onto mine, and he gasped one final word before going still. Run. And then he was dead. I had walked straight into a trap. And now I was next. Scott's body slumped against me, his dead weight sending shockwaves through my system. My hands were slick with his blood, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. This wasn't a warning shot. This was an execution. A cold, calculated message from Richard Vance. You're too close. Back off or you're next. I had seconds to react. The shooter was gone, but I wasn't safe. If they had a sniper or another man closing in, I'd be next. I dropped Scott gently to the ground, muttering a quick, I'm sorry, before scrambling for cover. My heart pounded as I crouched behind an old, rusted train car. The parking lot was still and silent, but I knew better. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I pulled out my phone and dialed Detective Adams with shaky fingers. He answered immediately. Richardson, Scott's dead. I whispered. Silence. Then what? Shot. A sniper or a hidden gunman. I don't know. I didn't see them. I peeked around the corner, scanning the rooftops of the abandoned train station. Nothing. Whoever did this was already gone. Are you hurt? Adams asked. No, but I won't be alive much longer if I stay here. Adams cursed. I'll send units now. Stay hidden. Do not move until I tell you to. I hung up and pressed my back against the train car, my breathing shallow. Scott had known something important, something big enough to get him killed the second he opened his mouth. What had he been about to say? The pool was just the beginning. The HOA, Vance had them working on. On what? I clenched my fists. Vance was cleaning house. Mark Talbot had been arrested. Daniel Everett had been scared into silence. And now Scott was gone. I was the last loose end. Footsteps. I tensed. Someone was approaching. I crouched lower, pressing into the shadows. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. Then a voice. Richardson, a man called out. You should have walked away. I didn't recognize him, but the way he spoke told me everything. He wasn't some random thug. He worked for Vance. He took another step closer. You poked the bear, and now the bear is poking back. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. You killed Scott, I said, trying to buy time. A low chuckle. No, but I made sure the guy who did had a clean exit. You though? You're a problem that needs solving. I tightened my grip on my phone. If I made a run for it, he'd hear me. If I stayed put, he'd find me. I needed a third option. Then I spotted something. An old, rusted wrench lying on the ground. Silently, I reached for it. The man sighed. Come on, let's make this easy. I don't like killing people unless I have to. I heard him step around the train car, right into my blind spot. I moved. I swung the wrench as hard as I could. It connected with his knee. The man let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward. His gun clattered to the ground. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the gun and aimed it at him. Don't move. He groaned, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. You little. Before he could finish, flashing red and blue lights flooded the lot. Sirens blared. I exhaled sharply. Adams. The man cursed under his breath, then raised his hands. Guess I won't be solving that problem tonight. Adams and his team stormed the scene, guns drawn. Freeze. The man didn't resist as they swarmed him. I lowered the gun, my hand still shaking. Adams reached me first. "You okay?" I nodded, still catching my breath. "Scott's dead. The shooter got away. But this guy? He worked for Vance." Adams looked at the man, his eyes hard. "Then we finally have a link." The officer cuffing him smirked. "Yeah, let's see how cocky you are downtown." The man didn't say a word. Adams turned back to me. "Come on, we need to talk." Closing in. An hour later, we were at the police station. I sat across from Adams in an interrogation room, still trying to calm my nerves. "You did good," Adams said. "Taking that guy down gave us leverage. But Vance? He's still out there." I swallowed. "And now he knows I'm not backing down." Adams sighed. "That's what I'm worried about. He's going to escalate." I looked at the one-way mirror, thinking, then we need to hit first. Adams raised an eyebrow. "You got something in mind?" I pulled out Mrs. Jenkins' notebook and placed it on the table. She's been watching the HOA for years. She's got names, dates, transactions, everything. Adams flipped through the pages, his face unreadable. This might actually be enough to get a warrant for Vance's offices." "Then do it," I said. Adams nodded. "I will. But in the meantime, you need protection." I scoffed. "I don't need." "You do," he interrupted. "And I'm assigning you a detail until we get Vance in custody." I sighed but didn't argue. I was in too deep to play lone wolf. Adams stood. "Go home. Get some rest. We'll take it from here." I nodded and left, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not until Vance was behind bars. Or dead. The next move. I drove back to my house, half expecting to find it burned to the ground. But it was quiet. Almost too quiet. I parked, got out, and scanned the street. Nothing suspicious. Still, my gut told me something was wrong. I walked up the porch, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. And froze. A single envelope sat on my coffee table. I hadn't left it there. Slowly, I walked over and picked it up. No return address. No markings. Just my name. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 4 words. "You should have walked away." A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't safe. Vance wasn't done. And now it was personal. I stood frozen, the envelope crumpling slightly in my hands as I stared at the 4 words on the paper. "You should have walked away." The weight of the message hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. And it was clear. Vance was watching, always one step ahead. I had stepped into a war I couldn't escape. The paper fluttered from my hand, drifting to the floor as I turned in a circle, scanning my house. Nothing seemed out of place, but I knew better. The silence in the air, the way the shadows in my living room seemed darker than normal, it all felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close, someone lurking just beyond my vision. I grabbed my phone and dialed Adams. "Detective," I said quickly, voice tight. "I just got an envelope. It's from Vance." There was a pause on the other end. "What did it say?" "You should have walked away." Adams cursed under his breath. "That's bad. He's escalating." "I know." I clenched my jaw. "I'm not going anywhere. He's not going to scare me off." "I don't like it, Richardson," Adams warned. "He's playing for keeps. You've made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the city. And he's got connections." "I'm aware," I muttered. "I'm doing this my way, Adams. We're this close to putting him behind bars. I won't let him intimidate me into backing down." Adams was silent for a moment. "Fine. Just keep your head down. I'll make sure we have surveillance on your place. Stay sharp." "Thanks." I hung up, turning back to the room. I wasn't about to wait for Vance to make the first move. I had to get proactive. I needed leverage, something that could bring him down once and for all. But what? I turned to the stack of papers on my desk, the records Mrs. Jenkins had given me. There were names, dates, construction projects, and shady dealings, but nothing that connected Vance directly to the land fraud or the forged documents, nothing solid enough to guarantee a conviction. I needed more. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I froze, my instincts kicking in. I wasn't expecting anyone, and this was too soon after the envelope. I slowly made my way toward the door, my hand hovering near the gun I kept hidden in my waistband. I pressed my back against the wall beside the door, peering through the peephole. There, standing on the porch, was an unexpected sight. It was Mrs. Jenkins. I hesitated before opening the door. "Mrs. Jenkins? What's going on?" Her eyes were wide, her breath ragged. It's bad. I think Vance is getting desperate. What do you mean? I stepped back to let her in, closing the door behind her. Mrs. Jenkins immediately began pacing. I've been going through my notes again. I found something I missed before. What is it? I asked, feeling the tension rise. She handed me a notebook, flipping to a page near the back. This is an address. It's not just any address. It's a place linked to the city's development projects. A warehouse just outside the industrial district. The records suggest Vance has been storing construction materials there, but I took the notebook from her, scanning the entry. My pulse quickened. But what? It's not just materials, Mrs. Jenkins whispered. It's files. I think it's where he's been hiding the evidence of his scams. If we can get in there, we might have enough to finally take him down. I stared at the address, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the break I'd been waiting for. But I couldn't just waltz in. Is there any way to get surveillance on that warehouse? I asked, already thinking ahead. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. I've been keeping an eye on it. I've seen cars come and go at odd hours, but nothing that looks suspicious. Still, I think if you can get inside, you'll find something that will be the smoking gun. I looked up from a notebook, already planning my next move. I need to get in there, but I can't do it alone. I'll need backup. Her face went pale. Don't trust too many people, dear. Not with Vance. He has eyes everywhere. I know, I said quietly. That's why I'm going to have to do this smart. I'm going to get Adams and the team to help me with a search warrant. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. It's too risky. If Vance finds out, he'll destroy the evidence before you can even set foot inside. I looked her square in the eye. I don't have a choice. I've already risked too much to back out now. She sighed. I'm afraid you're right. I just want to make sure you're safe. Please be careful. I nodded grimly. I will, but Vance has pushed me too far. The warehouse. The next morning, I was at the police station, filling Adams in on the plan. This is a bad idea, he said flatly, pacing the room. You're walking straight into the lion's den. I know, I said, my voice steady, but we have a chance to finally nail Vance. We can't let it slip away. Adams rubbed his temples. And you really think this warehouse is where he's hiding all the evidence? That's what Mrs. Jenkins said. If she's right, we'll find documents, contracts, maybe even blueprints for the land scams. Adams sighed. I'm putting my team on this, but we need a solid plan. Vance's people aren't stupid. They'll be expecting something like this. I nodded. I'll get in first. If the place is clear, we'll move in. But if things go south, then we pull back, Adams finished. But don't get yourself caught in there. You won't be able to talk your way out of it. I left the police station with the address in hand, my mind running through the logistics. I wasn't going to walk into this warehouse unprepared. I had to move fast, and I had to be smart. As I drove toward the warehouse, my heart pounded. The plan was risky. No one would be able to back me up for at least an hour, so I was going to have to scout the place out alone. The moment I pulled up to the warehouse, I felt like I was being watched. I parked a few blocks away and circled around to the back of the building, slipping into the shadows. The door was locked, but there was a small window on the side of the building. I peered through it, my eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. Boxes and crates lined the walls. The place looked deserted. I took a deep breath and pushed the window open. I was in. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of oil and machinery heavy in the air. My footsteps echoed as I moved carefully between the crates, my eyes searching for anything that stood out. Then, in the far corner, I saw it. A desk. Stacks of paperwork. I moved toward it, but just as I reached for the pile, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. And there, standing in the doorway, was a man in a suit. He smiled. Looking for something? It was Richard Vance. I froze, my hands still hovering over the stack of papers. Every muscle in my body tensed. There was no mistaking it. Richard Vance was standing right in front of me, blocking the only exit from the warehouse. He stood tall, exuding power and confidence, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. His eyes were calculating, and in that moment I knew I'd just walked into a trap. I forced myself to stay calm, but my mind was racing. How had he known I'd come here? Was he waiting for me? Looking for something? Vance repeated, his voice smooth, almost amused. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I could ask you the same thing. Vance's smile widened. Oh, I think you already know the answer to that. I glanced around quickly. The warehouse was quiet, the only sound my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. There were boxes everywhere, but no signs of anyone else. It was just Vance and me. So, I said, trying to buy time, you've been running this scam for years, huh? Land fraud, forged permits, buying off city officials. But now it's all falling apart. You must be nervous. His smile faltered for a split second, but then he chuckled. You've been digging deep, haven't you? His tone was cold, the amusement in his eyes replaced by something darker. Tell me, how does it feel to know you've been playing into my hands this whole time? I took a step back, my mind running through my options. I had no backup, no team. It was just me and Vance. But I couldn't afford to let fear paralyze me. I'm not backing down, I said, my voice steady. I have enough on you to bring this whole thing down. You're done, Vance. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. Is that so? I didn't flinch, but my hand subtly brushed against my waistband, where I kept my gun. Vance seemed to notice because his eyes narrowed. You think a gun is going to save you? Couldn't hurt to try. I shot back, though my palms were starting to sweat. Vance took a step toward me, closing the distance. You're not the first person who thought they could take me down, Mr. Richardson, and you certainly won't be the last. You were persistent, I'll give you that. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. He was too calm, too confident. It was like he had all the time in the world, like he wasn't worried at all. So what now? I asked, trying to buy more time. You gonna threaten me, or actually do something about it? He smirked, stepping even closer. You really think this is about you, don't you? His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. This isn't about you, Mr. Richardson. It never was. My stomach twisted. Then what's it about? Vance leaned in, his cold eyes locking onto mine. This is about control, about money, about power. You see, I didn't need the land from that pool project. The real game, he paused, letting the words hang in the air. The real game is much, much bigger. I was caught off guard by the sudden change in his tone. The cocky arrogance was gone, replaced by something colder, something far more dangerous. What are you talking about? I asked, taking a step back. You still don't get it, do you? Vance said, his voice almost pitying. The land deals, the pool, the development projects, they were just a way in. The real money isn't in small-scale projects like that. It's in large-scale city contracts, the ones that can change the landscape of this city. The ones that put millions, even billions, into the pockets of those at the top. And I've been orchestrating it all from the shadows for years. I was shaking my head, struggling to keep up. No, you're lying. Vance's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and contempt. You think the pool project was all I was after? I needed someone like you to stir things up. I needed the public to care, to ask questions. And now I have all the leverage I need. I didn't know what to say. I was in over my head, and Vance knew it. He'd been setting me up the entire time. The pool, the sinkhole, the shady dealings with the HOA, all of it had been part of a bigger plan. He was playing a game I didn't even know the rules to. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack from the far side of the warehouse. A door had opened. Footsteps. I spun around to see several more figures emerging from the shadows. Men in suits, all armed. Vance had brought backup, and from the looks on their faces, they weren't here to negotiate. You've made a big mistake, Mr. Richardson, Vance said, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction. You've interfered with something much bigger than yourself. And now, you're going to pay the price for it. I felt a wave of panic surge through me, but I forced it down. I was cornered, outnumbered. But I couldn't give up. Not now. Suddenly, a loud bang rang through the warehouse, followed by the sound of something crashing to the ground. I turned to see one of the men who had approached me collapse, blood pooling around him. The other men froze, and I quickly realized that the shot hadn't come from me. I spun around to see Detective Adams stepping through the door, gun in hand, a grim look on his face. Vance, he said coldly, you're under arrest. Vance's expression turned to one of sheer fury as he watched his men scramble to react. But Adams was too quick. With a few precise shots, the remaining men were on the ground, incapacitated but alive. Vance glared at me, his jaw tight. You think you've won, don't you? he sneered. You think the police can stop me? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Adam stepped forward, his gun still aimed at Vance. Oh, I think we do. And it's over. Vance sneered one last time before his shoulders sagged, realizing he had lost. He was done. Adams turned to me. You all right? I nodded, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Yeah, thanks for the backup. Adams looked at the group of men lying on the ground, then at the papers I had been looking through. Let's get this evidence secured. We'll take Vance in, get him talking. He's going to have a lot to answer for. I exhaled slowly, finally feeling like I could breathe again. Vance was done. His empire was crumbling, and I was one step closer to seeing justice served. But as Adams and the other officers moved to secure the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. I looked down at Vance, now cuffed and being led away. This isn't over, is it? Adams shook his head. No, but it's a hell of a start. The cold steel of the handcuffs around Richard Vance's wrists felt like the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He was escorted out of the warehouse by Adams and two officers, his head low, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and defeat. The world he'd spent years building was falling apart, and there was no way for him to escape it now. I stood there, taking in everything. The warehouse was quiet now. The only sounds the distant hum of police radios and the occasional shuffle of an officer's boots. The men Vance had brought with him were either in custody or nursing wounds that would keep them out of action for a while. Adams turned back to me, giving me a long, appraising look. You did good, Richardson. Really good. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. It's over. Not yet, Adams said, his eyes darkening. We still need to take Vance down in court. And trust me, he's going to make it hard for us. I nodded, knowing he was right. Vance would use every connection, every dollar, to try to worm his way out of this. But I wasn't about to let that happen. What about the warehouse? I asked. What about the files? We've got them, Adams replied. And we got the evidence we need. We'll be reviewing all to make sure we've got the full extent of what Vance was involved in. It's more than just land fraud. He's got his hands in city contracts, bribes, extortion. There's no telling how deep this goes. I glanced over at the stack of papers I'd uncovered. Those papers weren't just blueprints and contracts. They were the blueprint of Vance's empire. Now, they were in the hands of the police, and nothing would erase that. I can't believe it, I muttered. All of this, everything, was just to build an empire of control. Adams shook his head. That's the thing about people like him. They start small, then they get addicted to power. Eventually, they'll do anything to protect it. I looked over at the door where Vance had been let out. He thought he could get away with it. And for a while, he did. For a while, Adams agreed, but not anymore. The night went by quickly. The evidence was gathered, the criminals were detained, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fit into place. It was clear now, Vance wasn't just a businessman gone rogue. He had been manipulating everyone around him for years, using his power to control entire parts of the city, all while feeding his greed with money that wasn't his to take. The next few weeks were a blur. Adams and his team worked tirelessly to build a case against Vance. The evidence was overwhelming. There were the documents from the warehouse, proof of the forgeries, proof of the land grabs, and proof of his illegal dealings. There were records of bribes paid to city officials and emails that tied Vance directly to corrupt construction projects. Vance's empire of corruption began to crumble faster than he could keep up. His assets were frozen, his companies investigated, and his connections in high places severed one by one. The trial was quick, and Vance didn't put up much of a fight. The evidence against him was irrefutable. The jury took only a few hours to return a verdict, guilty on all counts. It was over. But as the months passed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The city had been saved from the likes of Vance, but how many others were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their turn to play the game? As I sat in my office, reviewing the final reports on Vance's conviction, I thought back to everything that had happened. The sinkhole, the pool, the mysterious people who had followed me. I had taken down a man who thought he could control the city. But I knew there were others, more powerful and more hidden, who had learned from Vance's mistakes. For now, though, I could rest easy. The neighborhood was safe again, and I had finally rid myself of the monster who had been lurking in the dark corners of the city. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, the weight of the past months lifting off my shoulders. It was over, at least for now. But deep down, I knew that the game was never truly finished. There would always be another player, another conspiracy, another fight for control.